Montana Territory, 1878. The sun was barely rising when Calvin Vance spotted her barefoot, blood on her dress, crashing through the pine brush like the devil himself was on her heels. He reined in his horse at the edge of the ridge, heart thudding against his ribs. What the hell? The girl, no. Woman was running full speed, breath ragged, skirt torn, hair tangled with pine needles. She glanced over her shoulder once and stumbled hard, slamming into the earth. Calvin was off his horse before it stopped moving. He crossed the slope in long strides, boots snapping twigs, his rifle slung behind him but ready. He reached her just as she tried to crawl forward, her elbow giving out beneath her. "Hey," he said, crouching beside her. "Hey now, you're all right. I'm not gonna hurt you." Her eyes green, fierce, even through the fear snapped up to his. She shoved at his chest weakly. "Please," she gasped. "They'll find me." "Who?" She didn't answer. Her skin was scratched up and bruised, and her right ankle was swelling fast. Her fingers trembled as she tried to push herself upright. He saw then the rope burns on her wrists. Calvin didn't ask another question. He scooped her up into his arms before she could argue. She flinched, but didn't fight. Her cheek pressed against his shoulder like she'd run out of all her fight. "I got you," he said quietly. He carried her back to his horse, lifted her up into the saddle first, then climbed up behind her. She didn't speak again, not even when he wrapped one arm tight around her waist to steady her, guiding the horse down the ridge and into the woods where the trail twisted toward his cabin. He didn't know her name, but he figured names could wait. He just needed to get her safe. The cabin sat by a stream, hidden deep in the Pine Valley. Calvin lived alone, had for 3 years since his brother died and the war ended, and he gave up on everything back east. He'd built this place with his own hands, kept it neat and strong. He carried her inside and laid her gently on the bed. She winced but didn't cry out. Her eyes tracked him, still wild with suspicion. He crouched beside her. "You need water, and something for that ankle." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. He poured her a cup from the jug on the table. She drank it in 2 gulps. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. She looked down. "Adeline." "Adeline what?" "Adeline Avery," he nodded. "I'm Calvin Vance." She looked up at him now, longer this time. "You live here alone?" "I do." "Are you gonna send me back?" He shook his head. "No. I ain't sending you anywhere." Her eyes filled with tears so fast it knocked the breath out of him. She looked away, jaw tight. He went quiet. Then he stood, grabbed the tin basin and some cloth and knelt by her ankle. "This'll sting." She nodded without looking at him. He cleaned the cuts and wrapped the bruising joint. She didn't make a sound. When he was done, he sat back on his heels. "You want to tell me what happened?" Adeline's fingers twisted in the blanket. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then in a quiet voice, she said, "My father owed a man named Harlan Deeks too much money. Couldn't pay, so he gave me to him." Calvin's gut turned. "I was with him for 3 weeks, she said. "He kept me locked up, said no one would come looking. Said he'd make me his wife when he felt like it." Calvin's fists clenched. "I waited until they were drunk last night, picked the lock. I ran till I couldn't breathe." "You did good," Calvin said, voice low. Adeline looked up at him again, and this time her eyes didn't look wild, just tired. "You're safe here," he added. "I swear it." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." Adeline slept half the day. Calvin kept near, chopping wood, boiling water, making soup from the beans and ham he had left. When she woke, she ate in silence, sitting on the edge of the bed, her foot propped up. That night, after the sun dipped behind the mountains, she asked, "Why did you help me?" Calvin shrugged. "Because you needed it. Most men wouldn't." "I ain't most men." She looked at him, then down at her hands. "I did not think I'd make it out." Calvin leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You did." Her voice was soft. "Because of you." The next morning, Calvin saddled his horse and rode into town 30 miles south. He kept his head low, asked quiet questions, and learned enough. Harlan Deeks was still looking, but he had no clue where she went. Calvin bought extra supplies, a bolt of cloth, and a worn pair of boots in her size. When he returned home, Adeline was sitting by the fire with a book from his shelf in her lap. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Your books are better than I expected," he smiled. "Brought you something." He set the boots down beside her, her eyes widened. Calvin, I cannot. They're yours," he said. "You need them." She touched one of the boots gently, like it was breakable. Then she looked up at him, really looked. Why are you being so kind to me? He hesitated. Then said honestly, because I want to be. Adeline's eyes shone. She reached out and placed her hand over his. No one's ever been kind to me without wanting something. Well, he said, voice low, I don't want anything but to see you safe. Her fingers curled around his. She didn't let go. Days passed. The bruises on her skin faded. Her ankle healed slow but steady. And each day, Adeline laughed a little more, spoke a little longer, came out to sit with him on the porch in the evenings. Calvin tried not to feel the way he did. But he did. He watched the way the sunlight caught in her hair. The way she always touched his shoulder when she passed, like it grounded her. The way she listened when he spoke, like his words mattered. One night after supper she said, Calvin, he looked up. Do you think I could stay? He stared at her. You want to? Adeline nodded. I do not want to go back to a world that lets men like Deeks buy people. I want something real, something good. Calvin stepped close. You could have that here. With you, he reached out, gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. If you want. Her breath hitched. I do. And then, without hesitation, she leaned in and kissed him. It was soft. Sure. Her hands slid up to his shoulders and his arms wrapped around her, holding her like she was something precious. When they pulled back, she whispered, I feel safe with you. Calvin rested his forehead against hers. You are. And in that moment he knew he was not going anywhere, not ever again. The first frost came early that year. It crept in one morning while the pines still held the last of summer's breath, painting the cabin windows in lace and silver. Adeline stood at the threshold, her shawl drawn close, watching the mist rise off the creek. She hadn't asked for a mirror since she arrived, hadn't sought one out either. But in the glass that morning, she'd caught her own reflection in the windowpane, hair brushed back, face pale but calmer. Not the girl who ran, not anymore. She glanced over her shoulder. Calvin was splitting kindling by the shed, bare-headed though the air bit. His coat hung open, shirt sleeves pushed up, and for a moment she just watched him work. The rhythm of it, the steadiness, it settled something deep in her. He noticed her watching. Cold out, he called, setting the axe down in the dirt. You sure you want to be out here? I've seen colder, she said, stepping off the porch. Virginia, she nodded. Shenandoah Valley, winters came hard through the gaps. He came to meet her halfway, his boots crunching lightly in the frost. You miss it. Sometimes, she said. Mostly the smell of summer rain on the wheat, but not much else. He didn't press. Instead, he reached for her hand, warm despite the morning chill. She let him take it. You hungry? He asked. She hesitated. I could eat. Good. I was about to cook up the last of the salt pork. She looked surprised. You'd share that with me, he raised an eyebrow. You think I'd let you go hungry, she smiled, just a little. You're a strange man, Calvin Vance, he chuckled. I've been called worse. Inside, she sat near the stove while he worked at the skillet, the smell of meat rising through the cabin. She traced her fingers over the table's edge, rough pines smoothed where hands had leaned, pressed, waited. Your brother used to sit here, didn't he? She asked. Calvin paused. Yeah, this was his chair. She didn't need to ask more. The grief sat heavy in the quiet, but it wasn't raw anymore. It had softened at the edges, like something worn down by time and weather. You ever think about leaving? She asked. Sometimes, he said, but there's peace here. I didn't have that before. She looked at him then, really looked. You never told me what you did before this. He flipped the pork slow. I rode dispatch for the Union Army. After that, I worked cattle drives down through Texas, drinking, fighting, sleeping under the stars. Thought I'd find something out there. Didn't. And here, he turned to face her. Then I found you here, her breath caught. She stood slowly, crossing the room. When she reached him, she placed a hand on his chest, just above the collarbone. I haven't known peace like this, she said. But I want to, with you, he covered her hand with his. Then stay. I already have, she said. I just didn't know it till now. They ate side by side at the table, the morning stretching long and golden through the cabin windows. No voices rose, no footsteps came near. Just the sound of two lives beginning to settle into one. Later that afternoon, she helped him mend a fence along the southern edge of the property. She moved slower on the uneven ground, but her steps were sure. When he handed her a length of wire, their fingers brushed and something passed between them unspoken, steady as the land itself. You ever think you'd end up out here? He asked. No, she said, winding the wire through the post. but I think I was always meant to." He didn't say anything. Just stood beside her, hand resting on the top rail, watching the wind move through the grass. By the time the sun dipped low, they'd finished the fence and stood quietly, side by side. He slipped his hand into hers, and she let her head rest lightly against his shoulder. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. By late November, the sun hung low all day, stretching long light across the valley floor. The trees had shed their last, and the creek ran slower, its edges laced with ice that cracked gently when touched. Smoke curled steady from the cabin's chimney. Inside, the air was warm with stew and pine wood, the scent of it grounding. Adeline sat on the floor by the hearth, her skirt tucked beneath her knees, sorting through a basket of dried beans. Calvin was at the table, carving a new handle for the axe with quiet precision. She glanced up. "Was this always the way you pictured your life?" He didn't answer right off. The blade of the knife moved slow across the wood. "I didn't picture much. I used to think I'd just drift till I wore out." She watched the way his fingers moved, steady and sure. "And now," he set the blade down, looked at her across the space. "Now I think about spring and what we'll plant. I never thought that way before you." Her gaze dropped to the beans in her hand. "I've been thinking too." He leaned forward a little, waiting. "I can sew," she said. "And I know how to make soap and keep bees if we can find a hive next year. I could trade some of it, maybe even bring in coin." Calvin's brow pulled just slightly. "You don't have to earn your keep here." "I know," she said, not defensive, just even, "but I want to belong to this place." "Not just rest in it," he nodded, quiet for a moment. "Then we'll build it together." She reached for another scoop of beans, but her hands stilled. "I had a sister once. She died when I was 12. Fever took her in 2 days. After that, my father never looked at me the same." Calvin stood slowly and crossed to her. He didn't crouch or kneel, just sat beside her on the floor like it was the most natural thing. The fire popped softly behind them. "I didn't know you had family." "Not anymore," she said. "And I don't want to carry them forward. Just needed the words out, I suppose." He didn't touch her, just let the silence settle between them like something solid. Then he said, "I used to write letters to Jesse after the war, even after he died. Wrote like he was still reading them. Figured it helped to get thoughts out into something." She looked over. "What did you write about?" "Mostly the weather. And what the sky looked like that day. I think I was trying to remember how to notice things." She gave a soft breath of surprise, not quite laughter. "You're gentler than you look," he shrugged. "You're stronger than you look." She smiled then, small but real, and leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "You think there's a church anywhere near here?" "Closest I know's in Deerfield, 30 miles west. I'd like to go, one day. Not for the sermon exactly, but to stand in a place where people believe in something." Calvin tilted his head slightly, resting his cheek against her hair. "I believe in this." The fire hissed as a log settled deeper into coals. Adeline sat up a little straighter. "I want a garden next year. With beans, onions, maybe even cabbage if the ground'll take it." He nodded. "We'll fence it in, keep the mule deer out." Her eyes lifted to his. "Do you ever think about children?" He took his time answering. "I used to think I couldn't be that kind of man, but lately. I think maybe I could." She studied him for a long moment. "I think you already are." He reached for her hand then, slow and certain. "If you ever wanted that, I'd stand by you." "I'd want that only with you," she said. The firelight danced across her features, catching the edges of something new in her, something rooted, not just surviving. Calvin squeezed her hand once, then stood and offered to help her up. She rose with him, and they stood close, neither pulling away. Outside, the wind moved gentle through the trees, and inside, the quiet between them deepened, not empty, but full of all that might come. The snow came in early December, soft and clean, burying the pine needles and fence rails in silence. Calvin stood at the window with a mug of chicory, watching the flakes drift down through the gray morning. Behind him, the cabin was still. The fire had burned low, and Adeline was bent over a small wooden box near the hearth, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're up early," he said. She didn't look away from what she was doing. "I couldn't sleep. I had a thought and didn't want to lose it." He came closer, setting the mug aside. "What are you working on?" She turned the box slightly so he could see. Inside were neat rows of folded cloth scraps from old shirts and flour sacks, each dyed a different shade with things she'd gathered from the hills. I want to make a quilt, something that's ours. He crouched beside her, running his fingers lightly over the edge of a violet square. You dyed these from elderberries, she said. The yellow came from rabbit brush. I've been testing what holds. He gave a quiet nod. You've got a good hand for it, she smiled faintly. I had to learn to mend young, but I never made anything just to keep. He sat back on his heels. You'll have time for that now. She met his eyes and her voice was steady. I want to stitch this winter into something I can hold, something that says I was here and I was safe. He didn't answer right away. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat hanging nearby and pulled out a square of deep brown cloth. From my old cavalry coat, thought it might fit in. She took it carefully, turning it over in her hands. I'd like that. The fire crackled beside them, the only sound for a long while. Later that morning, they walked the trapline through the trees, their boots crunching in the powdery snow. Adeline carried the canvas sack, and Calvin checked each snare with practiced care. 2 hares and a weasel by the time they reached the far bend of the creek. She watched him work, noting the way he handled each animal with quiet respect. You don't waste anything, she said as he reset a line. Never saw the point in taking more than you need, he replied. She was silent a moment. My father hunted for pride. Would leave game to rot if it wasn't big enough. I think that's why I stopped trusting him long before the rest. Calvin stood and looked at her. You don't have to carry that anymore. She nodded, but not like she was agreeing with him, more like she was letting something go. They walked back under a sky that had cleared to pale blue. When they reached the cabin, Adeline hung the hares in the shed and lit the stove while he salted the weasel pelt for trade. Their movements wove together without words, practiced now. That evening, she pulled out a bundle of herbs tied with twine and dropped them into a pot of boiling water. What's that for? He asked, drying his hands on a cloth. Cough season's coming, she said. This one's mullein and horehound. It helps the lungs. She poured the steeped mixture into a small jar and set it aside. I figured we might need it before spring. Calvin leaned back against the table. You plan ahead. I've had to, she faced him, her voice quieter. But I'd like to start planning for things that aren't just about surviving. He stepped forward. Like what? She glanced down at her hands, then back to him. A proper shed for the tools, a henhouse come thaw, maybe, a room for children when the time's right. His breath caught. He reached to touch her cheek slowly, making sure she welcomed it. When her eyes didn't waver, his hand settled there, warm and solid. When the time comes, we'll build it all. She leaned into his touch. I want to grow things, not just plants, I want to grow a life. You already are, he said. That night, wind rose through the trees, rustling against the eaves. Inside, they lay close beneath the wool blankets, the fire's glow casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the world had gone cold and white, but the cabin held steady. And in that stillness, they shaped something quiet and enduring, not just survival, but a home. January cracked open with a sky the color of pewter and snow stacked deep along the cabin's eaves. The wind had turned sharper, needling through the pine boughs in long, low groans. Inside, the fire never quite went out, and the days folded quietly into one another. Adeline had started keeping track of them in a small ledger. Calvin gave her a leftover from his army days, marking each with a drawn symbol instead of words. A pine cone for a peaceful morning, a ripple line for wind, a pair of dots for when Calvin made her laugh. That morning, Calvin woke early and returned from the woodpile with his shoulders dusted in powder. He brought with him a small, rough bundle wrapped in canvas and tied with twine. He placed it beside her on the table without a word, then poured himself coffee from the tin kettle. Adeline eyed the bundle, then looked at him. You're just going to stand there. He sat down across from her, hands wrapped around the warm tin cup. Thought I'd wait and see if you're curious. She untied the knot slowly, folding the canvas back to reveal a small, carved box with a sliding lid, stained dark with boiled walnut husks. Her fingertips traced the smooth wood, then slid the lid open. Inside were 2 gold bands, her breath caught. She looked up sharply. Calvin didn't smile, didn't shift in his seat. His voice was quiet. Trapper out east of Deerfield lost a finger to frost last winter. Sold me his wedding band. I traded him jerky and a spare trap. The other I made from a coin I kept from Virginia. Melted it down, hammered it out slow. Adeline touched the thinner ring, her thumb brushing the edge. You melted a coin for me. I didn't need it anymore. She closed the lid carefully. You sure? He held her gaze. I didn't know what love looked like until you put your name to this place. You didn't come here to be saved. You came here and saved me. She reached across the table, her hand resting over his. Then let's make it proper. They rode to Deerfield the next clear day, bundled thick against the cold. The trip took 2 days with the snow, and they stayed the night above the general store, listening to the creak of the old beams and the wind clawing at the shutters. Calvin barely slept. Adeline rested her head against his chest, her breath warm through his shirt. The preacher wore a patched wool coat and cleared his throat twice before beginning. The church was empty but for them and the storekeeper's wife, who watched with kind eyes. Adeline wore a dress stitched from her old petticoats, with a bit of green ribbon at the waist. Calvin stood straight in his washed shirt and brushed coat, the ring box tucked neatly in his pocket. When the vows were said and the rings exchanged, Adeline's voice didn't shake. She looked at him like she'd already lived 100 years by his side. Outside, the snow had started again. They rode home slow, their horses' hooves muffled in the white. When they reached the cabin, Calvin lifted her down from the saddle and kept his arms around her a moment longer than needed. I didn't think I'd ever see a day like this, she said. You'll see many more, he replied, brushing the snow from her hair. And none of them alone. That night, they sat by the fire with their supper, the room lit by lantern glow and the hush of snow drifting down. Adeline leaned against him, her legs tucked beneath her, her hand resting over his heart. I want to build the cradle soon, she said softly. Before I start to show too much, Calvin turned to meet her eyes. You're sure? She nodded. I took the tonic 3 times just to be certain. Come late summer, we'll have more than just the garden to tend. He exhaled slowly, wonder blooming across his face. You'll be the kind of mother children feel safe with, and you'll be the kind of father who teaches them how to listen to the wind and read the land. He kissed her then, slow and quiet. This is the life I never knew how to want. You want it now, she whispered. I want it every day. They built the cradle from pine cut just beyond the creek, smoothing the wood with cloth and patience. Adeline lined it with scraps from the quilt she'd finished in February, each square stitched by firelight, each thread pulled with care. By spring, the snow receded and the ground softened beneath their boots. They planted rows of beans and onions, and a pair of hens from Deerfield settled into a coop behind the shed. When summer came, the garden bloomed wide, and the baby arrived just after the wildflowers peaked. A girl with a cry like wind through tall grass and eyes shaped like Adeline's. They named her Clara, after the river Calvin crossed the last day of the war, when he swore never to carry a gun again. Years passed. The cabin grew by a room, then 2. Adeline tended bees in the far corner of the field, her veil catching light like linen wings. Calvin built Clara a swing from the old ash tree, and in the evenings they all sat on the porch, watching the valley stretch out in gold and green. They never spoke much of what came before. Not because it hurt, but because the life they built together was full enough to carry it all. There was no need to explain how they'd gotten there. The fence lines, the worn path to the creek, the ring around Adeline's finger, all of it told the story. And in the quiet hours, when the wind moved gentle through the pines, Calvin would reach for her hand, and she'd rest her head on his shoulder, and neither of them would say a word. They didn't need to. They'd already said everything that mattered.